Good evening and welcome to February 12, 2014 meeting of the City of Glendale Civil Service Commission. May I please have roll call?
Commissioner Yakubian? Here. Commissioner Devine?
Here.
Commissioner Hatamian?
Here.
Chair Gazarian?
Here.
For the record, Commissioner Manukian is absent tonight.
Next item, please. Thank you.
Minutes?
Move for approval without reading. Second.
Unanimous consent?
Yes.
Absent, actually, Commissioner Manukian. Thank you. Next item.
Oral communications?
I see no cards before me and no one approaching the podium. Thank you. Next item.
Recruitment and examination report?
Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is your recruitment and examination status report. It's a note and file item, but it's we generally want to give the Commission an idea of the recruitment workload and the status of all the recruitments that are currently going on right now. It's a fairly big list, and I guess that's good to see that there's some level of hiring going on at this time. The report does list all of the recruitments at various stages, the analysts who are assigned to it, and the dates and anticipated times for the various selection processes. Again, this is a note and file item. If you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them, and I have staff here as well.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you. Next item, please.
Eligible lists established?
Thank you, Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, similar to the previous item, this too is a note and file. As I always say, the eligible list establishment is the culmination of all of those recruitment processes that you see. For this month's or for this meeting, we have 6 lists that have been established. A bit surprising that they all happen to be promotional processes. Usually there are promotional or some open. But the promotional simply means that these exams were limited to city employees. As you can see from the report, the right column has the total number of applications received, and then the far right column has the total number who made it through the process and ended up on the eligible list. Once again, if you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them for you.
Any questions? Hearing none, thank you. Next item, please.
Job bulletin for approval, police sergeant.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is a job bulletin for approval for the police sergeant position. As you know, this is a sworn safety promotional examination process. As per our rules, it is required that the Commission approve of these bulletins. Again, not all bulletins come before the Commission, but under certain circumstances, we are obligated to do so. In this case, again, the police sergeant is a promotional position. We typically fill it in a promotional manner, as there are many officers that are eligible to promote into this job. It's quite a competitive examination process. If the Commission does approve of this, we anticipate posting the bulletin on February the 18th for approximately 2 weeks. This bulletin is fully consistent with the class specification for police sergeant. Again, the bulletin has all of the job duties, knowledges, skills, minimum requirements, and in the very back, the selection process is defined, which is going to consist of a written exam and 2 oral interview panels. If the Commission has any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. We have Chief Castro here as well, and Russ Kwan from my staff who worked on this bulletin.
Oh, there's Russ Kwan. Okay. Any questions? I have a couple of questions. I note that it states the GPOA has been given an opportunity to review the job bulletin. Have they responded in any shape or form?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, Russ Kwan, Human Resources Analyst. Yes, the job bulletin was sent to the Glendale Police Officers Association for consideration last week, and they have not voiced any concern.
Last week, do you know exactly when last week?
It was early in the week. I want to say it was last Tuesday.
Early in the week is good enough for me. Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
again, the GPOA, in addition to that, GPOA and all the associations do receive the full agenda packet as well.
Very well.
In case someone...
And we've received no feedback, positive or otherwise?
That is correct.
Okay. The education and training section has a bolded sentence pursuant to CSC Rule Roman numeral 8, Section 4G. All conditions for eligibility must be satisfied no later than 30 days after the final filing date. Can you direct me where the final filing date is in this bulletin?
That would be under the closing date, which was third line down from the title
Oh, I
of
see.
sergeant.
Okay. So the closing date is the final filing date?
Correct.
Right, okay. Next, I want to direct your attention to the selection process. Under item number 2, with an asterisk, it seems that the sentence does not end. Is there something that my copy does not show that yours does? It says, "and that I have followed," and then it stops.
Missing a period.
I'm not sure where.
Oh, it's at the bottom of that, at the end of that, number 2.
It's, "I certify that all the information provided on my supplemental application is true and accurate, and that I have followed."
Right before the boxes that say yes and no.
I
Under
see.
two.
That portion was accidentally left off of the disclaimer. It should have read that it certified all the information provided on the supplemental application is true and accurate. I have followed the instructions.
And I have followed the instructions?
Correct.
Okay. Is this a certification under penalty of perjury, or is just a certification in good faith? In your opinion?
It would be under good faith.
Good faith. Is that sufficient in your opinion?
Yes.
Okay. I have nothing further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Move for approval. I have one question actually of Mr. Kwan, just in regards to the selection process.
Yes.
I show that there is a minimum passing score of 70% in order for the applicant to be invited to the next phase of the recruitment process.
Yes.
And then I show that there is a written examination portion that's 10%, an oral interview of 55%, and an appraisal or promotability assessment of 35%.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process? Is it based on these numbers? Am I accurate in saying that in order for an applicant to go to the next phase, they would have to get the 55% in the oral interview and also the 35% in the assessment in order for them to move on, or can they get any percentage?
The percentage is shown on the job bulletin in that 10% being for the written examination, 55% being for the oral board interview, and 35% being for the promotability assessment. That constitutes what the eligible list score would consist of. So what we would do is administer the examination. So let's start with the written examination. In order to move forward to the oral interview, you would need to effectively score 70% on the written examination. That's our minimum passing score. So let's say you score at least 70%, you move forward to the oral interview. You have to score at least 70% on both the oral board interview as well as the promotability assessment interview in order to make it onto the eligible list. If you've scored at least 70% on all three of those components, then we would combine the three different scores and attach the various weights, the 10%, the 55%, and the 35%, and establish your overall score.
Okay, so scoring 70%, for example, in the oral portion, would that get you the entire 55%?
Now,
or just...
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Tom, perhaps I could help. Each
Please.
of these examination components are graded separately, and they are scaled on ultimately, regardless of the format, they are put on a scale of 0 to 100% with a minimum passing score of 70 to pass each of these sections. So the first step in this process will be this written exam, and typically we'll have maybe 30 or 40 candidates at that phase of it. Anyone passing that exam with a score of 70 or above will proceed on to the next phase, which involves 2 oral interview boards. They will take each of those 2 interview panels, and then at the very end, we'll take all the scores and scale it down to each individual test component. And assuming that person got at least a 70% on all 3 of those components, they pass the exam, and their name gets placed on the eligible list. And of course, they're ranked in order of from the highest score to the lowest score. The 70% is a civil service rule requirement, and it's set up that way to make sure they passed every component. Because you might say, well, gee, what if I score really high on one area of an exam and then I get maybe a 60% on another component? That person's not going to pass the process overall. They have to pass each one with a score of 70 or above. So,
It is different than the California bar examination, in other words. It seems to be more difficult to pass these tests because to become an attorney, you can pass one section and do poorly on another section, but they average it out.
It becomes difficult. Sometimes, like in the fire department, we have a fire engineer exam, which actually has 5 separate components, one where they drive the truck, one where they operate the aerial ladder, and another where they might pump the fire engine, and each of these components, somebody could do great on 4 of them and poorly on one, and unfortunately that's not going to get them on our list for that position. So that's really the process is designed to be challenging and to make sure that this individual is competent in all areas of the job.
And I suppose much thought has gone in to allocating only 10% on the written examination, despite the fact that the written examination obviously tests one's knowledge of certain rules and regulations. That begs the question, the oral board interview and the promotability assessment interview. I've heard over the years that there's outside panel, inside panel. Can you comment on these boards or interview processes, how they're done?
Yes. The oral board interview is what's most commonly referred to as the outside panel.
Okay.
What we would do is solicit raters from the outside agency, and we have them come in and rate our applicants based on a series of standardized questions as well as dimensions. So for this purpose of the oral interview panel, we'll probably have some outside lieutenants. We'll generally have outside lieutenants who sit on this portion of the panel.
But no inside on that?
That would be on the promotability assessment
Okay,
panel.
all right. Very well, thank you. Any other questions? Move to approve, I think, was made.
Second.
Okay. Yes?
Yes.
Yes? Unanimous consent, absent Sam Manukian. Thank you very much, Mr. Kwan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item, please.
Class specification for approval, Deputy General Manager, Glendale Water and Power.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is the requested approval for a newly established class specification, Deputy General Manager for the Glendale Water and Power Department. As the report indicates, in the 2012-2013 fiscal year, through the process of reductions, layoffs, and retirement incentive, I would say the existing upper management structure of GWP was pretty well gutted. At that time, prior to all of those reductions, the department had a total of 5 assistant general managers, one over the water section, one over electrical, one over the power generation and supply, one over administration, one over finance. These are all very high-level positions. Following those reductions, we're now down to 2 assistant general managers, and I think through the passage of time, we've come to realize that the department does need some additional managerial support at that level, which is something that is being proposed here. Mr. Zern had the option of possibly reinstating another assistant general manager, but he's choosing to establish this position of deputy. It's one level below, and it pays less than the assistant general manager, and I think in filling and trying to put the pieces together on his upper management team within Water and Power, he's choosing to fill one of his key vacancies at this level. So with that, and if you have questions, Mr. Zern is here, Ms. Akopian as well. Again, this is a newly established specification for your review. And the organization chart is provided as well.
Any questions? You have questions?
Please.
Under the education and training, where it says graduation from college, university, et cetera, I don't see the words "is required" the way we've done on other exams, and I'm wondering whether that is required or whether it's negotiable.
It should be required.
While you're at it, forgive the interjection, can you then explain the note at the bottom of that page? Because it seems to say substitute is okay.
Mr. Chair, I'll address that. The note is it's a boilerplate portion of every specification we have. In those circumstances where a candidate may be lacking of a particular qualification, whether it's experience or education, if they have a sufficient level of let's say they're short on education, but they have an overwhelming amount of experience. It would provide us with the flexibility to process that person forward. And again, that's on every specification. It's not an action that we do very commonly. There would have to be some really overwhelming evidence that that's warranted. In this case, I can assure you that this position does in fact require a bachelor's degree, and whether it says required or not, if in the absence of the word required or optional or desired or anything like that, you can always assume it is a requirement for that position.
I have other concerns, but I'm going to yield at the moment to my colleagues. Were you done or no? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I do have a concern also with the sort of the education and experience piece of this. I have been an advocate of sort of a broad education requirement in the past, as my colleagues know, but I think they've converted me,
You're gonna see
and
it
I'm
now.
coming around to your
There
side
you
of the
go.
camp here, especially with respect to the Glendale Water and Power and issues dealing with the utilities. I mean, it is a very sort of specific space, and I saw where you had required civil, electrical, or mechanical engineering, which I applaud. And then all of a sudden, randomly, we have or business administration, public administration, or related field. I would assume that you would prefer to have the discipline be squarely in the engineering field. So I think that at least, my suggestion would be to strike, everything after or business administration, public administration. I don't think that business administration, public administration is a related field to engineering at all. And similarly, with respect to the experience piece, 8 years of responsible management experience with a utility. And I would ask to be more specific with respect to the what a similar organization constitutes, because if it's a well, anyways, let me leave it at that. I would want to know what a similar organization is, because I don't want any sort of ambiguity or after the fact equalization of another agency being similar or not to a utility. And frankly, on behalf of some of the other residents of the city of Glendale, I think that we really need to be very vigilant and careful in who we are appointing to the Department of Water and Power, given everything that's been going on with, I know my bill has gone up significantly, and I'm sure others have as well. So I have very serious concerns about the loose requirements of this bulletin as written.
Well, Ms. Yakubian, let me first say nobody's more vigilant in wanting to make sure that we have the best quality staff in that department than I am.
Excellent.
But with that said, Water and power is a very diverse operation. It is not strictly an engineering operation. I myself am not an engineer. And I've run both the public works, I do run the public works and the water and power department, which in the past has somewhat traditionally, I guess you could say, been an engineering field, but no longer is that the case. And no longer is that the case in water and power either. You're seeing a lot of attorneys and financial people who are running utilities. But with that said, keep in mind this is deputy AGM for the entire department. So we left it somewhat broad because let's say we have a deputy in the water services or electric services, then by all means, that would be an engineer specific to that operation, an electrical engineer, or a water engineer, civil engineer, or if it was power, a mechanical engineer. This particular position that we're recruiting is a generalist position. It's the administrative AGM. It's somebody who does finance, legislative, HR work, is our liaison with finance, who manages the general aspects of the office. That doesn't require an engineering degree.
Well, let me ask you a question. Did you have utility experience before you were appointed in your current position?
Yes. Public Works has its own utilities.
Okay, so you had that experience.
Correct.
It wasn't a sort of similar organization. So your lack of the engineering degree was more than made up of by your experience in utilities. And I note here that on the first page it says, may perform the duties of general manager in his or her absence. So while I'm comforted by your, the breadth of definition that you have assigned this specific job, I am concerned, this was brought to my attention, I'm sort of learning on the job here, I'm the newest commissioner, by some of the other commissioners, that in the event that someone is standing in the shoes of their supervisors, then maybe a little bit more is required. In any event, I thank you for explaining, but I kind of stand by my concerns. I think that it would be better to have someone who's experienced in the utilities and someone who's in the engineering field, because I think that the business administration, public administration, or related field is very, very broad.
And just to sum that up, it would be, as the deputy AGM, this actually falls beneath the other two AGMs, who are generally the ones that would step in and manage the operation in my absence. That's considered to be short-term absence. I know I was out for an extended period of time. I don't plan on doing that again, as much as I can control that.
Exactly.
But the individual that would be in this position is somebody who is well-versed, a generalist, somebody who can step in and do very much what I do. I don't think that needs the absolute technical background for the general administration of the department. If you're running the electrical department, I agree. There's no way we would not have somebody with that very broad technical or very precise technical experience. But
do you think that it's necessary? I mean, it would be a negative to have someone in
it wouldn't be
engineering?
a negative. No, ma'am. It would not be a negative. But I don't think it's necessary either. I don't think it should be an absolute requirement. But absolutely, it's not a negative. If we had somebody that happened to have an engineering degree that possessed all of the other skills and talents that would go with being a generalist and managing finance and HR and all that, well, absolutely, I would never be biased against anybody with an engineering degree or registration. Mr. DeMar.
Wow.
I was about to yield to my engineer.
No, not at all.
With that, I move for approval.
Well, with that, I'm going to ask to address you very briefly. My problem with this was the following. One, in the definition, the second line of the definition, it talks about the position performs responsible management, administrative, and supervisory duties. The supervisory duties aspect of it is what caused me concern, because when I take the supervisory duties and I take a look a little bit down the line under essential functions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th paragraph, assists with preparation and administration of the water and power annual budget, ensures the preparation of various engineering, financial, and operating reports. Every time I see engineering, I feel like I'm fish out of water, and I'm thinking when I come back to education and training, and and I have the same concern as Commissioner Yakubian, when I'm okay with it to say a bachelor's degree in civil, electrical, or mechanical engineering. When you get into our business administration, I go, okay, that's business administration is great, but what does he know, he or she would know about supervising something that has to do with engineering? I suspect not much. The public administration takes me further away, or a related field now takes me into a minefield as far as I'm concerned. And I'm one of those that, is big on people in supervisory positions to possess the requisite qualifications, preferably be both education as well as experience, as opposed to one substituting for another. So I would ask that on the education and training, at a minimum, the words "is required" ought to be added to that paragraph, because it does not, as it sits right now, make it a requirement.
I'm okay with that.
Mr. Doyle will join us in a second. Is required. What do you think about those two words, first off, Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle?
Under education?
Yes.
Certainly,
That ought to be added.
to make that clear.
And then when we say that it's a boilerplate language at the bottom, when we have the note, an equivalent combination of experience, education, and/or training may substitute for the listed minimum requirements. Well, the listed minimum requirements include the education bachelor's degree requirement, but then we're actually saying it's not required. So if we're going to do that, that language, the boilerplate language, as you called it, ought to be tweaked a bit. It ought to be an equivalent combination of experience and/or training may suffice, so long as the educational requirements are met. So that would suffice for the 8 years, perhaps, that responsible management experience or utility with a utility or similar organization, but it would not do away. As it reads now, it technically does away with that requirement. Does it not?
You could say that, Mr. Chair, but I can tell you, and I hope you would have the trust in me.
I do have the trust in you.
That note is employed very, very rarely.
Okay.
And typically, what will occur is, we'll have a process. Someone will get rejected for whatever reason. They may choose to appeal internally that decision, and I may look at it and say, you don't meet the qualifications, and they may come back and say, yeah, but and not putting this aside, the person may say, you know what, I'm 10 units short of a bachelor's degree, but I have 25 years of utility managerial experience in a utility.
You want to have that latitude.
Come on, yeah.
Okay.
In a case like that,
okay.
I might say, okay,
Okay.
you've convinced me. That seems fair. But this is not language that we employ, and that decision, my staff knows it. That has to come directly to me, and it may be employed maybe once or twice a year if the case comes. But our general philosophy is to stick with the experience and education requirements and go with that. Typically, when we have large numbers of people applying, we might have that luxury of saying, sorry, you're not you're going to be screened out. But I just want to make sure you're aware that this is.
No,
not something-
you're asking. You're hoping that I trust you. I do. You're asking me to trust you some more. I'll trust you some more. That's
Appreciate
the
that.
bottom line. Any other questions or inquiries?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go first.
Go ahead.
Okay, I just have a quick question regarding the note and the education, what Garo suggested, and the leeway that it provides to Mr. Doyle. Has it ever, in your experience, created any type of confusion for an applicant who's applied, and again, like you said, may have years of experience but not the education, and or vice versa, and let's say they were rejected, their application was rejected. Does it create an opportunity for them to say, well, how come so-and-so was given the opportunity and I wasn't? Because what it does, it does create that level of discretion. But in your experience, has it ever created that where an applicant was left a little bit confused as to why they weren't selected, so on?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Hatami, and it's a fair question, and the answer to that is yes. occasionally we will get challenged and someone will say, well, you've got this note on the bulletin. You can let me in, right? And as I said, I mean, it gives us some degree of discretion, but it's not a level of discretion that we would ever abuse or utilize that frequently. But yeah, you're correct. It does sometimes create that. But I'll tell you, again, a perfect example might be, someone. I gave you a hypothetical earlier. Let's say someone, the position in question requires 6 years experience and a bachelor's degree, and the individual has 3.5 years or 4 years of directly related experience and a master's degree. I might look at that and say, you know what, a master's degree exceeds the basic educational requirement. Is that worth another year of experience as qualification? I might agree to include that person. So it kind of cuts both ways with both experience, education. But, for a position like this, I wouldn't anticipate that type of consideration having to be given, and unless we did an open recruitment and we come across a candidate with 30 years of experience in the field who might be a little bit shy of a bachelor's degree. But
What is this? Is this open or promotional?
I think we anticipate filling this internally.
You do? Okay.
Yes. And I will note on the experience, the language that is listed here, the responsible management experience with a utility or similar organization, this is identical to the language on the general manager position for which Mr. Zern holds. And it's essentially what enabled him to be considered
Well, you have to be
from
careful.
Public Works to
Essentially.
Water and Power. And he's not the first Public Works director to move over into Water and Power. Mr. Cameron, yeah, a long time ago. So.
And you said, one last question, I promise. On the notes, you said that it's typical for us to use the note in our examinations, because the only reason I'm bringing this up is looking back at the police sergeant position, and the example you used is what triggered it in my mind to go back to this examination is the educational requirement. You said if somebody comes in and they're going to be getting their bachelor's in 3 months, 6 months, however, they have years of training, then you might consider that.
Right.
Looking at the police sergeant examination, I didn't see the note. However, on
It's there. The note is there. It's in the note is
Am I
before the
missing it?
selection process. Yeah.
Oh, I see. However, with the education and training,
No yellow on there. I don't.
we do say that if the individual is lacking certain conditions, then they may have 30 days after the filing date. Has that been also considered in this examination, just to kind of further clarify?
Commissioner Tommy,
Examination.
yes, that provision, which I'm not sure why it's in such bold type, but
Sticks out.
So it needs to see it.
was that intentional, Russ?
Thanks a lot, Russ.
Okay. That's actually right out of our civil service rules, and that's if within 30 days of the final filing period, someone's qualifications can be met. So if I'm 2 weeks short of having reached my 3 years as a Glendale police officer, we'd look at that final closing date. And
Can that be included
30
in
days.
this examination, just to further clarify for an
It
applicant?
applies to every position.
I agree, it
Yeah.
applies.
It's a civil service rule.
Agreed.
Right.
I'm just saying, if an applicant is looking at the job bulletin, they might not go through our civil service rules to determine whether or not.
Yeah, but I'm not concerned about it because they just declared that they anticipate filling this position internally. So I expect a civil service employee of this city to abide by the rules, and if they don't know about it, they'll come to know about it if it applies to them.
Okay. So we're selective with the bulletins as to which ones we include the civil service rules on and the ones that we don't. What is I'm just wondering what the rationale is, that's all.
Well, first of all, this is not a bulletin. This is a job specification. But I don't believe we do include these on the every bulletin, unless it's on the back somewhere. But it's something we can consider, putting that language on all of our bulletins, which would provide that level of disclosure to everyone. So.
I guess the only reason I'm bringing it up is because of the level of discretion that it's given in the note. I would hate it for an employee who, again, you mentioned the circumstance of the educational requirement and the number of days or whatever that they have in order for them to fulfill it. For them to have any type of vagueness in their mind.
Sure.
I'm thinking it'd probably make your job a little bit easier too.
Okay, we'll do that.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, the words required will be added. Go ahead, Commissioner Devine.
I just had one question on the org chart, the proposed org chart. You indicated that this position is below the chief assistant positions and is shown here at the same level. So I'm wondering whether that's going to be altered so it fits in.
Mr. Devine, they actually, in the organizational structure, are on the same line. What I meant to say is the chief assistants, in the case of my absence, they would be the first to have the priority to go into the acting role, the interim role, or to sit in my place. So it's more of a tenure situation.
Okay. But you said that the pay scale for the deputy is less than the chief assistant. Is that correct?
It's less than the chief and it's less than the assistant, yes. It's essentially the entry-level assistant or deputy general manager.
And I guess there's a promotion line where the deputy can promote up eventually to the chief assistant.
That is correct.
Okay. Also on the legal, HR, and finance items, do you have those sections within Water and Power, or are those interfaced with the existing?
Interface with the existing, thus the dash line.
Okay. And you show a dash line coming off a line that's not connected with any particular position. And I'm wondering now that the deputy general manager is going to be handling the legal, HR, and finance issues, whether that line, just for clarity, needs to come off his box rather than...
We leave that there, Mr. Devine, because finance will still play an integral role, the chief financial officer, as will Mr. Doyle and his staff as HR. So this position will handle the day-to-day administration and tracking and those type of things, but working closely hand in hand with both the finance department and the HR department, and also with legal.
Okay. That answered my question, and I move for approval.
With those two words, required, is required. Yes, Mr. Doyle?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Second?
Second.
Favor?
No.
No. Okay, let's take a roll call.
Commissioner Yakubian,
No.
Commissioner Devine,
Yes.
Commissioner Hatamian,
Yes.
Chair Gazarian.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item, please.
Class specification for approval, IT infrastructure manager.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is similar to the previous item. This is a new class specification. Due to some restructuring within the IT department, this is a new classification, not necessarily a new position, newly budgeted position, but a new classification, IT infrastructure manager, which will oversee the infrastructure services, the networking, and the various components, as well as the security function. This position is, obviously, it's quite technical. There are a variety of minimum qualifications that would be at play here. And, it's quite an important position for our organization. This is for your review and approval. I have Brian Ganley, who's our IT director, is here, as well as Mr. Kwan, who advises that department as well. So,
Any questions? No questions. Motion?
Move for approval.
Second.
Yes.
Unanimous consent, and Commissioner Manukian is absent. Thank you. Next item, please.
Civil Service Commission, staff comments.
Any comments? No comments. Thank you. Next item, please.
Agenda forecast.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle.
Chair, members of the Commission, really nothing planned for the next few meetings. We'll continue to have bulletins, specifications, and as you know, there are some hearings ongoing But really, the next specific item for the commission appears in April. But really, this is a note and file item. If there's anything that needs to be added or included, be happy to entertain that.
I'd just like to mention that on the 312 meeting, I will not be here.
Where is that, by the way? Can I see the agenda?
It's before closed session.
Well, it's a little too early to say I won't be here, but we'll wait. No. All right, thank you. Next item, please.
Closed session as follows. For item A, public employee discipline, and item D, public employee discipline. Items B, public employee discipline, as well as item C, public employee discipline, have been pulled off the agenda. Items A and D will be discussed in closed session.
Thank you. This will conclude our televised portion of this evening's Civil Service Commission meeting. We will report out after our closed session, but however, not on camera. Thank you.